What happened to Russia's massive Kirov Class nuclear-powered battlecruiser that's meant to be capable of firing 174 missiles? Why has this ship been docked since 1997, receiving renovations? And what has $5 billion and 30 years of upgrades made it capable of? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out. The story of the Russian Navy's Kirov Class, Admiral Nakhimov, reminds me a little bit of that US Navy's littoral combat ship, because at heart the story's a tragedy. They were built for one thing, and then they morphed and evolved into something else, and then they never really exactly seemed to nail the landing. One thing seems to be a truism that transcends across time, space, and nation states. Naval procurement is an unholy nightmare of a money pit. Originally, 5 of the Kirov classes were planned to be built back in the 1970s and 80s during the Cold War. When Brezhnev took power in 1964, the Soviet Navy's ambitions skyrocketed to the moon. A massive shipbuilding program kicked off with the goal of turning the USSR into a true blue water navy. The plan back then was for them to have this nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and a surface fleet capable of at least matching NATO in the Arctic, if not outright just dominating the region by the end of the 1990s is what they wanted. However, sometimes the best laid plans of man don't always go according to plan. But first, I want to talk to you about some fascinating things happening in the world of autonomous fighters. General Atomics Aeronautical Systems has been working with the United States Air Force for years to develop AI and machine learning for their Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA. Everything General Atomics has done for the past 30 years has been about advancing the collaborative efficiency of human-machine teams. It's been an evolution from line-of-sight controls to long-distance satellite relays, adding automated processes such as automatic takeoff and landing, remote taxi, and other systems, all to protect warfighters. Over the past few years, General Atomics has developed the software and hardware crucial for CCA, cycling lessons learned from the field right back into the design process. No one else brings these strengths to the new paradigm needed for CCA. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this soon, because the Air Force says that the next aircraft in the CCA effort, which it has designated the YFQ-42A, is going to take flight later this year. Our thanks to General Atomics Aeronautical Systems for sponsoring this episode. They had the political buy-in, they had the resources necessary to build that massive fleet, but the hard part is actually figuring out how to put pen to paper on that kind of massive naval project. Project Orlan cruisers were originally supposed to be a roughly 8,600 ton ship, but it morphed into a 28,000 ton battle cruiser. It sticks out 16 stories above the water. It can carry 700 sailors. That's like my entire graduating class of high school on this ship. It has 3 helicopters because their initial role was as anti-NATO submarine hunters. Its sheer scale was meant to strike fear into the hearts of any nation that dared cross their flagship vessel. Of the 4 Kirov class that were actually built, 2 were retired in the 1990s due to the lack of funding thanks to the Soviets' collapse. Those are currently in the middle of being scrapped for spare parts, and the last one constructed, Peter the Great, the Kirov class one, is only one that's left that's fully mission capable. And that leaves us with the last one, the one that we're focused on for this video, the Nakhimov. It's been in dock and been upgraded since the 1990s. But here's where we start to run into some of the problems. Since the dream of having those nuke-powered aircraft carriers was never realized, the Kirov class today makes a lot less sense, especially since only one of them is operational. One of the other ones suffered a malfunction in 2004, and it was a whole hullabaloo. One Russian admiral said this about the Kirov that malfunctioned. He said, quote, "The ship is in such a state that it could explode at any moment," end quote. Other Russian officials admitted that while the reactor did need some work, it was no more a danger than all the others, with them stating, quote, "You can say that any ship is capable of exploding at any time." That's an actual quote. It's like the RMK reactor meme in real life. In theory, it's stocked to the teeth with air defense systems in case enemy aircraft from those aircraft carriers attack it. There's a ton of S-300 and S-400 missiles on board for intercepting those NATO aircraft. It's supposed to be a defensive air defense bubble floating around against NATO aircraft. It's meant to swat down incoming jets and then launch off its long-range missiles at the American aircraft carrier from far away with even more volume. Instead of trying to build a massive fleet of aircraft carrier groups, Russia decided it'd be easier to build ships that are designed to blow up aircraft carriers. That's the huge difference in doctrine, in theory, and in mindset. What exactly is a battle cruiser? Yelling "you sunk my battle cruiser" doesn't have the same ring as "you sunk my battleship." It sounds weird. And it is. This is a little bit of semantics. The definition can vary, but usually a battleship is larger and slower moving than your battle cruiser. This might be more easier to compare to like the CGN in the US Navy. Ultimately, those CGN American nuclear powered cruisers proved to be too costly to maintain, so they were retired between 1993 and 1999, and we'll get into how that relates to this as well in a minute. Technically, and I love to get technically, the Russians classify them as heavy nuclear missile cruisers. In fact, these Kirov were a huge reason why the US Navy brought back their old Iowa class battleships from the 1970s for a bit. They were a quick way to counter the Russian battlecruiser without having to build brand new ships of their own. In 1959, there was a proposal to convert the Iowa class into a missile-armed battleship, believe it or not, that would have seen its guns removed from the deck and like 16 Polaris VLS launch tubes replacing it. That is cursed as f***. I've seen a ton of YouTube videos on cursed guns. There are not enough cursed naval ship videos out there. The last major deployment that the Nakhimov saw was back in 1991 during a patrol mission in the Mediterranean. So there's some historical precedent for it to be over there. Afterwards, funding for upkeep was hard to come by, and it rarely left port. Between 2006 and 2012, the Nakhimov, Admiral Nakhimov, she sat in port, and they toyed with different ideas for overhauling her capabilities. Work on the ship resumed in 2014, but budget delays and new capability requirements pushed it to where we are today, still sitting in a maintenance bay. Well, currently it's sitting in the Sevmash shipyard, which is way up north near Finland and Sweden. This shipyard is best known for being Russia's only producer of nuclear submarines, which is why the nuclear-powered cruiser was sent there for this refit. But is this Russian battle cruiser ever going to really be ready to deploy? In February 2025, a Russian defense insider told Russian media outlets that the Nakhimov's dual nuclear reactors were launched, quote unquote, which I'm hoping was just a bad translation because I don't want to hear anything is launched having to do with anything nuclear. The report goes on to state that by summer of 2025, we can expect to see it back out on the water again for tests, a first since 1999. But Russia says that they've almost got it figured out after the new upgrades that they're putting on it. So what kind of upgrades is it getting? Of those 174 missile launch tubes that we talked about, 80 were going to be specifically for different cruise missiles, one of them being the new upgraded hypersonic 3M22 Zikron with a 600-pound warhead, with a top speed of Mach 9 and a reported range of 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles. This outclasses that old Soviet-era P-700, which only had a range of 370 miles, although its warhead was much bigger at like 750 kilograms or 1,650 pounds. The Admiral Nakhimov is one of the only two remaining Kirov class battlecruisers. This is the type of gigantic ship that we only see uniquely in the Russian Navy. They're the largest non-aircraft carrier ships in any navy in the world. These sea beasts are the only nuclear-powered ships designed for combat that aren't aircraft carriers or submarines. This essentially gives them unlimited endurance to go as far as they want forever, as long as they're kept resupplied with food and ammo, of course. By contrast, the US Navy only has submarines and aircraft carriers that are nuclear powered. The Nakhimov was basically a delivery system for your P-700 missile. Its whole purpose in life was to be giant and carry an offensive amount of missiles. for a nuclear infinity amount of time. But why does only Russia have this type of ship with this kind of strategy? The answer to that rabbit hole explains the fundamental difference between what the Russian and US Navy prioritize. The US Navy is built around carrier battle groups. The American strategy has long been centered on power projection, meaning it wants the ability to rapidly deploy forces anywhere in the world to maintain that dominance. However, in contrast, the Russian Navy has historically been more focused on sea denial rather than sea control. This means their ships are designed to make operating in their territorial waters and the surrounding areas as difficult as humanly possible for the enemy navy, rather than them trying to project power across the globe as much. It's like my old squad leader used to always say, the best defense is a good defense. Its other purpose was my favorite naval doctrine, gunboat diplomacy. What is gunboat diplomacy? It's when you use your naval power and the implicit threat of force to achieve political or diplomatic goals. You could also call it sea extortion or floating ultimatums. The Russian Kirov class, with its gigantic size, was likely built for gunboat diplomatic purposes. But for a dummy ground pounder like me, what does flagship mean? I've usually only heard that in the context of my uncle saying that his used car dealership in Port Jefferson is his flagship store. But in the context of the Navy, it means the lead ship in a fleet or formation, usually the most powerful, advanced, or prestigious vessel. The term originates from the naval tradition from the 16th and 18th century, where a fleet commander would sail on the ship that very literally carried the flag, which signaled their authority. Okay, let's assume it works out and it's pressed into service eventually. Where would it go? The Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. This zone contains huge reserve of oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, and it's a major shipping zone for Russia's economy. With the addition of Finland and Sweden into NATO, it's a really sensitive location recently if you look at it on a map. With Russia's modern naval deployments being stretched thin, the Admiral Nakhimov, I think, would likely be deployed in one of three key strategic zones once it's fully operational, hypothetically: the Arctic, the Pacific, or the Mediterranean. To me, the Arctic seems like the prime candidate due to its increasing militarization through many different countries up there. Russia has been doubling down on creating ice-breaking ships for here, and we've recently started to see signals from the United States government that they're interested in what happens in the Arctic region more. You might remember that the US government started saying that they might want to acquire Greenland, and one of the main stated reasons for that is because Greenland's location is important to military defense operations. The US already has and maintains a base there, which serves as a critical early warning system for missile defense, but there's also a lot of economic interest when it comes to resources here. So Russia, the US, and even China are signaling interest in this watery region more than ever before. If Russia deployed this Kirov class to the Pacific, it could help them contest the waters near China, North Korea, and Japan. Personally, I think this would be less likely of an option. The Mediterranean and Middle East remain strategically significant. It'd be crazy to see one of these massive Kirov classes floating around Africa. It looks like Russia may be withdrawing from their naval base in Tartus, Syria, but they just gained a new port in Sudan in Africa. So could we see the Admiral Nakhimov there? It's true, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has taken a beating against Ukraine recently, but they're still making new moves. They're still trying to get those ports in Sudan, and getting there is easier when you're nuclear powered. The Admiral doesn't have to worry about refueling for literal years, but this does come at a trade-off of money, the dollar bill. It's expensive to run 2 nuclear reactors. The upside to an expensive nuclear reactor for the Admiral, though, is it's essentially got that unlimited infinity power. If needed, the battlecruiser would be able to sustain its top speed of 32 knots while weapons maxing with all of its missiles. So it's something worth keeping an eye on. But it's interesting to note that the most easily comparable units that the US Navy had were just they were decommissioned because they were too expensive. Is the juice worth the Russian squeeze? That's what I think it comes down to. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and signing off this net. Time now.